the work I've been doing for about 9 years now, to understand the limits of Singaporean understandings of where food comes from, and then go beyond this to think about this regionally. So I would really want to state right from the beginning that regional solidarity has been the aim for me in understanding what a changing food landscape is. I will go into what is changing and how is it changing, and also to knowing that there are many people in this audience that are not focused only on Singapore. I'll try to show how I start with the problems of what I consider inattention in Singapore, to extend that to a region, and to say that there may be more similarities between Singaporeans and some city inhabitants in whether it's in Bangkok, Manila, Yangon, or really just thinking beyond Southeast Asia as well. So the question here is, and I'm just diving straight into this because in 30 minutes I want to get quite a bit going. And then we have more time for discussion afterwards with Jeff as well. And one of the questions here is the city, the garden city or the city, is it a source of rupture or the start of an edible urban commons? And I will show why this question begins to matter. So one thing is to say that I'm tailoring this talk to a very broad audience, and I'm not expecting any specialization in any field. I draw on concepts from geography and urban studies. And I really need to emphasize, I will go over quite a few of these things quite fast, but still to give some context about Singapore's 30 by 30 food security policy. And I also really want to emphasize that the ideas here come from discussions I've had with groups here. These are really collaborative efforts. What I present is research based around these efforts, and it's absolutely not to elevate research over practice. The two things go hand in hand. It's just here that I focus more on the research aspects of it. So to give a very big sense in brief, there's two main things that I've been thinking a lot about. One is that Southeast Asia's food system is a product of developmental policies. And you can often see a lot of issues that come up where you have social struggles that come up around environmental and social issues. And this comes from contradictions you find within the capitalist production system. And the second thing is that growers and eaters, or you can also call them producers and consumers, depending on how you think about it, are divided by rural-urban living and also labor conditions and their national economic context. The image that you see on this is really a schematic diagram from the FAO's State of Food and Agriculture report in 2021. And I've highlighted the parts that Singapore tends to focus more on. But I also want to say that a really important part that is often forgotten is that Southeast Asia has so much focus on these other parts that are not highlighted. And I will spend some time in this talk talking a bit about space and about labor. So Singapore tends to focus a lot on modern supply chains, but it's not just Singapore that does that. Most of Southeast Asia is structured in this way, and many other supply chains exist, and we can try to bring this up more in media, is the main gist of the talk. And I'll come back to this again. So some very recent news to give context. Just last week, we saw this in the news in Straits Times that a $65 million fish farm is to be sold off at a fraction of cost. I've just pulled out parts of this, and I'll do this through the talk. There's different types of media I draw on. Here you see that this aquarium, or rather it's not aquarium, it's a fish farming facility. It's owned by a subsidiary of Apollo Aquaculture Group, and it will be conditionally sold to a local construction and engineering firm. So this is just to kind of point to the way the current agri-tech space in Singapore has evolved out of a history where you had former fish farm and family farms, which then became, after 1975, after economic changes with Goh Keng Swee's economic policies, it changed more towards aquarium industries and then some agriculture. And there's been a lot of connection now still to the aquarium industry and the construction industry. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of agricultural knowledge in the spaces that are now agri-tech. So what is 30 by 30 and what is the way it's been implemented? How has it been implemented? A lot of 30 by 30 was about systems change. When I say 30 by 30, I'm referring to the food security strategy that was introduced by the former AVA, now SFA, Singapore Food Agency. And this has been quite a long-running thing since 2017 at least. So this entire concept was based on understandings of food security robustness, which was introduced by Paul Ting, and which emphasized the need for local production in addition to diversified imports. Conceptually, it's a really, really tight approach with a lot of thinking that went into it. But there's been a lot of issues that came with implementation and with reduced private funding after 2021. And that's a lot to do with the increase in militarization across the world because of multiple wars, also to do with effects from COVID that continued on, and then supply chain problems. So one of the questions is, what's the actual reasoning behind 30 by 30? Is it just economic reasons? Was it a lot about this international space of sustainability and agri-tech coming into space because of all the interest in climate change around 2019? And if you look into the timeline, which I've drawn up here, you can see that if you see 2016 was the Impossible Burger launch. The Temasek Foundation was one of the major investors in this. And that kind of has pulled through all the way. Temasek is still one of the major investors in most of the firms that you see, whether it's the big firms, the Sustainer, and some other ones. In Singapore, we've also had the world's first and still only lab-grown chicken McNugget in December 2020. And that was introduced to the public with absolutely no public consultation, no discussion around whether this is something that makes sense for people's nutrition. And is it a direction that people want to go in? In 2023, there's been an ownership transfer of more than 70 farms. And so from 2017, you see this movement within the government and within the land leases at that time to say that, okay, now there's going to be a public tender. By 2018, you had some plots handed over to the new tenants. So it's been an ongoing conversation since then. And what I'm showing here is things you would read about in the news. But in the next slide, I'm going to show things that were being heard by people who were more on the ground or were more connected to this space. And that is that even as plots were being handed over to new tenants, there was a lot of discussion and questions actually by people who were interested in having a farm. Like, why is it not possible for me to have a farm if I already have quite a bit of agricultural knowledge? Why can't I continue on as a tenant? There were some most successful tenders that came about. Promised agri-tech as an option. There were unsuccessful tenders that included things like diversified agri-tech and land-based systems. By 2022 to 2023, you started hearing quite a bit about systems failures, the high running costs, construction holdups, because, for instance, most of the land was not on the grid. So each separate farm had to put up their own generator, which took about a year of additional time. So there's been a lot of additional implementation problems. And one of the major shifts since then has been not just agri-tech, but to move towards lab-grown meat. And this is just something I'll come to before I move on to another part of the talk, which is that within the food system, there's so many new innovations that are coming out. Cellular agriculture is used to refer to things like lab-grown meat. And there's been a lot of questions in the media as well about whether this makes sense, whether from a scientific point of view, it can reduce carbon, the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. Can you actually use cellular agriculture to replace meat at the same economy of scale? Does it make sense? And it seems like at this point, with a lot of agri-tech in the rest of the world, there's been a lot of pulling back away from cellular agriculture, while Singapore continues moving on as the perfect spot for testing. So as a result of this, because Singapore is the only place in the world where you can actually buy this, it's legal, it's for sale. Singapore is now seen as a lab for many firms from the US, Israel, South Korea, and you can see this if you look up these news sources that I'm listing here. So the most recent article on this is from Bloomberg, and it talks again about a change within Singapore and questions whether this 30 by 30 dream is still possible, is it still feasible, or is it actually going to change? So most of this is to bring this back to the question of what are some of these emergent problems in the context that we're looking at. Even though Singapore has this dream about feeding supplying 30% of its nutrition with, supplying 30% of its nutrition with local production by 2030. There are many problems where it comes to the way it puts capital into this entire production. And that's because the way most agri-tech, including how Singapore agri-tech works, is to work with fintech as the approach. So it takes venture capital, which often wants quick returns, and it doesn't work for agriculture, which requires a longer time, and it has many like actual physical, biological things that need to work. The second thing is that, and this is referred to in a newspaper article, is that often, even if you can have the product, it doesn't mean that local supermarkets want to stock the produce. And this is something that organic producers and non-chemical producers in other places that I focus a lot on Thailand. So this really happens in Thailand as well. You might have alternatives, but it's hard to get it to the people who you are hoping will eat the food. So some of the lessons that I am drawing that I hope we can talk about is there's really a transition to sustainable food that is being missed here. And that's because there is not enough attention to how people are emotionally connected to space and food. And these things are really important. And I just draw this text box in yellow, just to point out some things that I will come back to in the second part of this presentation. So one example of emotional connection is this Lei Cha hawker stall that some of you may know, that has moved across different spaces, and draws a lot of its food from Firefly's farm, which had some issues, and I think they have had to move up to Malaysia. So there's been some grief around the loss of the traditional farms. So I need to go a bit into this excitement around food systems transformation, because from the Singapore side, all you hear about is why is innovation good and how can it feed a growing global population. And I need to address this before I move into some of the criticism around this, and then move beyond that into what can happen regionally. So there's one main assumption here, which is what you often hear is the base message is the world's population is growing, there's not enough food, we need to feed people, or we need to grow more. And this is connected to the idea of a modern supply chain and the need to securitize this. So securitization happens in many ways, which I will talk about in a bit. But for now, just to say, what is a modern supply chain? So the FAO's State of Food and Agriculture report in 2021, they define this. They define modern supply chains, traditional supply chains, and transitional supply chains. And I think it's actually a pretty good report, but there's also stuff to look into. So they define modern supply chains as serving large urban populations, where you have supermarkets and large processors who transact directly amongst themselves. It's often with cold storage and is meant to serve private quality standards. It's highly concentrated and multinationals dominate. That this can create problems for smaller companies. And technology is largely capital intensive. So with this comes other things like drones, GPS, global positioning systems, and then from there you can also think about the forms of surveillance, the forms of control that enable this securitization of the supply chain. So the FAO report says that supply chains like this, modern supply chains, they are seen as less vulnerable because they can switch between markets and increase their capital labor ratio. So I'll explain what this means later. But so they're seen as less vulnerable because they can switch. And the second thing is they can implement biosecurity measures, which means health and means sanitization, so you don't have avian flu and things like that. There's many ways these firms do this, but I first want to point to how the FAO thinks about a food supply chain. So you have, and if you really think about it, this food supply chain is there's a lot of control that comes into this. It's also very structured in the way it approaches what this supply chain looks like. So I've highlighted the parts that Singapore really focuses on, and that's finance, production, and processing, and also equipment. And the parts that are not highlighted, you can actually find that in many Southeast Asian agricultural economies. I mean, most of Southeast Asia is agricultural. You have transportation, you have storage, distribution, machinery, fertilizer, fuel, and labor. And it's most of all of this that is then taken into the body and affects how human health is. The other thing to note is that Singapore has moved a lot towards cellular agriculture, as we just talked about. And this is considered food of non-agricultural origin. See, it includes meat analogs produced through synthetic biology. That's exactly what cellular agriculture is. So even though things like lab-grown McNuggets might be it's slightly outside of the way livestock is produced, it is still roped into the agri-food system and it starts to influence this entire chain. So some of the criticism that comes with this, and I'll spend a bit of time on this, and then I want to move into the questions around space and connection to land. The criticism that comes with this is that you have mega companies that start to take up a lot of decision-making control over who gets to eat what. And despite the fact that there is quite a lot of food that's produced by smallholders that is not traced and not registered, one of the effects of this is that it's very easy for big companies like Unilever, which is a multinational, to lay off thousands of managers without explaining why. And this was happening around a time where, as you can see in this report, Unilever was shifting away from food towards health, beauty, and hygiene. And there's many reasons why this happens, one of which, although it is not explained in this report, one of which you can guess it's because it reduces the risk for Unilever to focus on products that are of a higher value, like health, beauty, and hygiene, rather than food, because food is a very risky sector that's affected by climate change directly. The way modern supply chains are securitized and what effect that has on people is that you end up with huge horizontal and vertical integration. We don't see much of this in Singapore because in Singapore, the way the system is set up is that we are the consumers of food. So we don't see everything that laborers go through in producing the food. We see this in Thailand, which is a really big agricultural country. Something else that happens is that you get this huge consolidation of the seed industry. This is an image put together by Phil Howard at Michigan State University. He put this together some years ago, so there's been a lot of change. You can see from the purple boxes which the big companies are. So Bayer is a really big company. Then you have Corteva, ChemChina, BASF. And some of these companies, including BASF, especially BASF, was a former company based in Germany that was producing chemicals for the Nazi Holocaust, Nazi concentration camps. So you see the trajectory of control that comes through, that now goes into the agri-food industry. One quote to leave you with is a quote from a Thai seed saver I know, where she says that if you control the seed, you control the food system. And there's many stages in the seed business where it's not just the end users the end users are the main clients. But there's many things that you have to go through. You go through trials, you go through registration to make sure that you have breeder seeds and then certified seeds. And one of the things that's happening legally is that you have something called the Plant Variety Protection Act that was first promulgated by commercial seed breeders in the US before the 1930s. And then it was pushed through in the EU. And it's been very slow in the uptake because for many countries, it does not make sense. And it's really only there to support commercial seed varieties, and it pushes out diverse seed systems. So this leads to the major criticism of these really big modern supply chains, which is that you end up with a lot of chemicals that are used in order to create this control and of a homogenized monoculture. And you also have kinds of new technological additives like this GM yellow rice, which is meant to bring nutritional benefits, but actually does not do this. So the main thing I want to move us more to now is that there's a lot of, when I say hidden abode of production, I'm referring to social and ecological relations that actually support this production. So when I said that there's a lot of food that's actually produced already, it's not that we have insufficient food. I'm talking about medicinal and food trees, underutilized crops. Eco Asia is based in Thailand. They have a headquarter in Chiang Mai, and they do a lot of work. You can also look them up online. They have a lot of resources available in different Southeast Asian languages and English. And just to give some images from doctoral field work I'm doing, if you ask smallholders, these are coffee growers. If they have land and if they can grow something for themselves, they do grow subsistence crops. And these are fresh. They're much better than the things you would find in supermarkets, and they're not registered. So you can't find this on any actual source that is the stuff that urban, like as when you're doing secondary research, that's what you would look at. But you don't find this because people don't necessarily document this. So a lot of the issues that we're seeing now in the world and also in Southeast Asia is that there's increased supermarketization. And you really see this like after COVID, Singapore supermarkets suddenly had a huge amount of plastic packaging, but also just a lot more supermarkets put in so much more effort into ensuring that they have a good supply chain because COVID-19 brought together, it showed you how unresilient this kind of long distance supply chain can be. So the focus has been on consumers and retailers so that you can move from having something from soil-based growing that then becomes something like a cassava chip, for instance. So what this creates is a lot of downward pressure on producers, and people often plant less for themselves and more for retail, or they start to hire other farmers, or they might leave farming entirely. And this takes place over generations. So it takes time to understand how this happens. Something else this depends on is an increased use of data systems within the food system, and something some people call a modularization of food ingredients. So Singapore's media space doesn't always talk about this, but if we try to step outside of this urban frame of what a food system, this urban mindset of being the ones who are consuming it, this is actually what's happening in the places that produce food. So I'm spending too little time on the space, but I want to point to some other things from practice that I've been exploring. And one is to think about what urban eaters actually want. So this assumption that consumers only want convenience and sanitization, I found that that's not the case. Many people want to plant at home. And that was something I found with two friends in a group named Tana, where we created something for ArchiFest in 2016. And then we did some little bits of activities around it. So one of the questions I had was, what kind of information do people need to adapt to having green spaces where you can just pluck something or share something or grow something, what kind of routines would people need to form? Can we imagine having this in urban spaces? And does that change the way our public spaces are produced? So some of you may recognize that this picture on the right is in the heart of Raffles Place. It's right above the MRT station. If you come into this space, you're only surrounded by sound, it's constant advertising, and people are just walking around all the time. In this space, we created a garden, and we realized that people spent a lot of time in the mornings and the evenings coming to the garden, spending time there, plucking, and just doing something with their hands. And we realized also that this garden creates a space that lets people learn something differently. It lets them recall and become familiar with certain types of plants. It takes them out of the usual work setting. So I've written about this in one paper, which we can talk about later. But the point is to kind of move through these spaces. So I will show another one that from another piece of research in 2017, where I continue on with this line of thinking around what can space do? How can bringing people to a garden space change the way we start having conversations about food? And what I learned here was consumers or eaters are not just interested in convenience. Again, as we walk through these gardens, we visited 4 or 5 different gardens, including one in NUS. I realized people were asking, why is Singapore's urban soil so poor? So from the act of observation and spending time, and sometimes people brought their families and also their helpers, you start having conversations about food, and which is so much out of the picture of Singapore. In this project, I also got people to draw what they expected to see and then what they saw afterwards of, what their expectations of urban nature. And people had so many different ways of thinking about what nature can be in a city space. For some people, it was very controlled nature, which is also an effect of what they see around them. For some people, they really just took joy, like you can see on the bottom left. Some people just took pure, sheer joy in seeing that things can grow in difficult spaces as well, even when you don't expect it. So a lot of the thoughts I've had around this are how to bring these capacities for understanding and how to keep growing it. So you might start in one space, maybe someone comes to a space, they start to have a new way of thinking about it. But can this go beyond one space to other spaces? And can we think of these as capacities that we can grow? There's content-based capacities, and there's what I consider more learning-based capacities. So metacognitive would be thinking about thinking. So can we learn from one another? Can we build this capacity to learn from one another? Can we build a capacity to pay attention to things? Can we learn to move from scarcity to abundance? And a lot of discussions around the commons are about this. So this last part, I'm just going to show some things that I'm starting to do with many collaborators in Southeast Asia. This is the next part of the work I want to do, to keep working with people in the region and beyond. And with a few friends that I've listed here as well, we've started working more to think about how to build on our separate kinds of work towards what kind of food systems in our context that is fair. What does it look like? So a lot of this is also to come back to this question of what do eaters want? How do we reframe relations to food as cultural practice? In July, we just had a workshop after about, I would say, more than a year of work, actually. Like, it's just been a lot of building over time, where we brought together people from different contexts, and some of whom are also in the audience here today. And I will just end off very briefly, again, to say that if we think about Southeast Asia as a physical body, and there's a Thai scholar whose work, Siam Mat, thinks about the land as a geobody, and I've always really, really found that very clarifying. If we think about that and we think about the kinds of agribusiness power that exists in this region, I'm talking about agribusinesses like CP in Thailand, CP Group, really, really big group, one of the biggest in the world. I think it's really important to look at the messaging they have in things like sustainability reporting, but also look beyond that and learn to understand how these things are connected to the structures of power that exist in each country. So I'll just wrap up by saying what I think scholarship can do and what practice can do, and then that's the end of the presentation. Firstly, I really, really want to work with more peers, scholars, junior scholars, or whatever, at different stages. But I want to work with more people to read Southeast Asian economies in combination through a relational approach. And there's a lot of work from food regime theory that I think is helpful for this. And we can also read, I think it's really important to read a few countries together within a specific time period. Southeast Asia has come out from the post-colonial context and the anti-imperial context. And I think, citing it in that space is important. Also, many countries have a communist history or an anti-communist history, depending on which perspective you look at it from. And also looking at things from focusing on the space of social reproduction is really important. And there's a lot of readings around feminism, struggle, care, and maintenance of the modes of production that I think we can look into. And the last point on practice is that I think for as scholarship works with practice, if we can work across supply chains that FAO differentiates to align efforts, and there are already many, many peasant organizations doing this in Southeast Asia, but perhaps there's an even greater need at this point for labor and agrarian movements to work together. And this is not to underestimate any of the work people are doing. There's a lot, and it's already at peak capacity. But I hope that from this, at least more people in urban spaces, including Singapore, we can start to understand what are the types of media that are needed and how do we increase empathetic understanding. I think that's my cue to end.
Great. Thank you so much, Huiying. So let me turn things over to Jeff Ho, who will give us some of his comments. And after that, we'll be taking questions that Huiying will be responding to. That will take us to about 9:30. So without much further ado, Jeff, take it away, please.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. Let me share screen as well. I just have a couple of slides. Okay. So first of all, I really appreciate this talk that Huiying just gave. As some of you may know, I'm new to Singapore, so like everything is so fresh and interesting. And I knew about the 30 by 30 policy, and I also have come across some of the recent news, like the one that you just shared about the fish farm. And so I like the talk really kind of gave me a much more kind of grounded understanding of kind of what are the nuances, the issue behind the scene. And so that was great. And then I think we impact so much into the 30 minutes, and there's a lot to digest. But I want to kind of pick up on a few things, and maybe start with sort of the lexicon, right? So you have Garden City in your title, as well as commons, as well as regional solidarity, and even the regional food system. And I think putting these terms together, I think create a really interesting kind of conceptual picture, as well as things that are on the ground. So on the screen, you're looking at if you know a bit about city planning, you must be familiar with this diagram, and that's kind of where I'm coming from a design and planning background. So Garden City, beyond like how it is kind of appropriated in the context of Singapore, refers to a concept, a city kind of planning concept that was introduced in the 19th century in response to congestion, overcrowding, all the kind of negative aspect of cities, in which countryside was seen as sort of a cure to the problem that the city was having at the time because of the industrialization, urbanization at the time. And there's a really interesting parallel between what happened with the Garden City movement and then I guess like the 30 by 30, right? So I mean, there's a good intention in trying to promote kind of food self-sufficiency, alternative types of production. But similarly, if you look back at the whole kind of history of Garden City movement, it also started out with similar kind of aspirations, right? But then it ended up what Garden City have resulted was actually a very different kind of consequence on the way urban human settlement have been designed around the world, right? So we ended up basically with suburb. We ended up with non-city, sort of Frankenstein city, a city that's not quite a city as what it used to be, right? So functions are segregated. It's hard to get around. People's relationship become more distant, and you ended up with something that was not quite anticipated. And another part of this parallel, I think, was the way Garden City was implemented, right? It was through capital, right? Investment, real estate, state machine, right? How Garden City become institutionalized, right? And there's a very interesting parallel between that and how like the way Huiying talked about the 30 by 30 kind of policy, which is really it became sort of a technocratic solution to the food crisis, right? So the big corporations, the multinational, and all the kind of stakeholders and players, and I cannot help but to draw this kind of parallel between what happened now and then what happened historically with the Garden City movement. And then in that context, I think it's interesting to look at the practices of commons, right? So commons as in this particular context is something that exists outside the state and the market, right? It's a sort of a counterpoint to what was presented earlier about all the big multinationals, corporations, state and things like that, and I think as to counter the domination of capital on food systems. I think one way is to really try the reformist kind of approach would be to like work with the system, trying to do kind of small fixes and things like that. And I think there's some kind of value to that. I think the policy takes a very long time to evolve and to get implemented, and you do have to start somewhere. But oftentimes it's more effective if you actually work outside the system, right? And they are big system versus kind of small systems, right? So I think we need to look at kind of these system as kind of multiple systems, right? And commons is could be an alternative system that allow people to experiment, allow people to kind of self-organize, to learn, right? To exchange knowledge, to produce knowledge that is outside the state corporate system, right? And to create something that is really kind of an alternative to what is being presented, by the capital. And then I think, the next kind of lexicon I think is also an interesting one. This idea of regional solidarity, right? And so I think and solidarity can be manifested in a lot of different ways, right? So we're not really trying to replicate another system in which kind of food get shifted, shift from one place to another, that kind of regional system, right? We're looking at a system that is more decentralized, more locally based, but it's beyond just the local in terms of like these kind of singular locations. We're really looking at a network of maybe small organizations that can find inspiration from each other. They each one continue to practice in a different way, but they begin to kind of exchange notes, begin to learn from each other, and learn from how individual group respond to the local context and processes, and uh, so one example, so I've been involved with some of the community gardening kind of activism in East Asia, right? So things that have happened in Korea and Taiwan, to some extent in the PRC, Hong Kong, and also part of the United States as well, because a lot the community gardening as a kind of concept of movement is really something that was borrowed from the States. And I had the fortune of being part of that sort of knowledge network. Right? So we have when I was in Seattle, we have hosted visitors from Korea, from Japan, from Taiwan who wanted to learn about how the community gardening system worked in Seattle. We have been invited to give talks in Taiwan and elsewhere, and really kind of to build the knowledge and how the community garden movement in Taiwan really kind of learned from their counterparts in Korea. Right? So when Park Wang-soon became the mayor in Seoul, he pushed I mean, still a top-down kind of policy, but at least is to kind of work with the civil society to create a network of community gardens around the city, and they aspire to be like London, to have as many community gardens there as well. And our friends in Taiwan really kind of learn from we kind of aspire to the kind of policy that was implemented in Seoul, and sort of push for a similar kind of framework in Taipei, and where the number of community garden went from just a handful in 2014 to over 700 today. And thanks to this kind of regional knowledge network that was instrumental in terms of understanding how things work, how urban governance work with urban gardening, and how like it's not just the policy, but how the civil society can be a really powerful force. So coming back to this notion of commons, to this notion of kind of alternative systems, and yeah, so I hope these comments are useful in terms of picturing or imagining some of the concept I think that was introduced by Huiying in her talk, but having the ability to kind of imagine that things that can happen on the ground, right? So what form does it take? How do people organize? Right? What are some of these success stories? And so I want to kind of leave that there so we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. So I guess we've got about 15 minutes or so for discussion. We already have questions that are in the chat. Jeff, could I ask you just to stop sharing?
Yes.
So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, great. So firstly, we've got a question from Rachel Wong, who's curious about how the labor movement or trends in agricultural labor is affecting Southeast Asian food systems. And we're going to collect some of them to save time. Our friend Chi Kian, is wondering if the appraisal of one, the efficacy of existing community gardens in terms of food knowledge and social networks, and two, past histories of agriculture and agricultural land use might make this narrative more complex. So let's start with these two first. Huiying, take it away.
Okay, so yeah, the point about labor movements, I'll first answer Rachel's and then come to Chi Kian's point. So the labor movement and trends in agricultural labor definitely affects Southeast Asian food systems. If you look at who is migrating and who is doing the actual agricultural labor, just to take Thailand as an example, I'm using Thailand as an example because I've been spending a lot of time there and that's the focus of my doctoral work. But also because Thailand is one of the biggest agricultural economies in Southeast Asia, it has the producing side of the supply chain and it also has the product side, so the entire chain. So you have a huge amount of income inequality as well because of this. A lot of agricultural labor in Thailand is actually not, there are Thai workers, but you also have workers from Myanmar who are also of ethnic minority, and they often come in undocumented and they are seasonal. Agricultural labor across the world, including in Thailand, is usually informal and very hard to organize. So when it comes to agricultural labor and labor unions, there are very, very few. I mean, Singapore is not used to thinking in terms of unions, but there are labor unions in Thailand as well, and they're quite strong. But agricultural labor is very hard to organize within these unions. So it's very hard for the unions to push for safety and including personal safety, health, the kind of protective gear they might wear, the kind of civil rights that they have. It's very hard for the unions to take care of these laborers. So that's one thing. If we think about the actual movement of people, it's usually cyclical. So you have people coming in for one season of harvesting or growing, and then they go somewhere else. And this is happening more and more because of the way the different political economies in Southeast Asia are shifting. So for instance, Thailand used to be they used to have more labor within agriculture. And now because they have moved from being a developing country, like a low-income country to a mid-income country, so they've been reclassified. And they have a lot more people trying to become middle income. So you have less people wanting to be farmers and more people coming in from other places. So that also changes the kind of people who are directly involved in that labor. And if you have more questions, we can talk more specifically about what you are interested in. I think Pekan's point is really, really, yes, like it makes the narrative more complex if we start to expand the time span of Singapore and go beyond the usual understanding of Singapore as just being urban. So Cynthia Cho's chapter in a book that Timothy Barnett edited is a really good chapter on this. It's called The End of Agriculture in Singapore. And she talks about the history of agriculture. And she has an amazing line, which I will never forget, where she talks about Goh Keng Swee's discussion of the peasant, where he says, around 1975, he says, leave the peasant to the anthropologist. It's time for us to move towards a different kind of economy. And that's at the exact point when 1975, where his policies are instituted and Singapore moves from having almost 100% self-sufficiency for many, many years, way before the British came in 1819. And it moves towards trying to be a high, like to have manufacturing and then from there to move into information tech. So past histories of agriculture and land use open up our understandings of the present and the imaginaries of the future. That's something I really, really felt after reading her piece. And then the appraisal about efficacy of existing community gardens. I think a lot more work can go into this. So I come from a background in psychology and also psychological medicine in the university hospital setting. And there's been some work that looks at efficacies of working in gardens, of having kind of garden exposure. And I think there's a lot more work that can go into this also. And that's something that at least I know quite a few people in other parts of the world, but also in Singapore, there's a small group I work with called Living Soil, and we are trying to look into the social relations that gardens provide and contribute. Yeah.
Great. So we've got two more questions up. I'll read them out so everyone can hear them. One is from Lotta Othil, I hope I've got your name right, who would like to ask if there's some example of how to engage people in relations to food as cultural practice. And then another from Asa Sonia's daughter, who's grateful for the presentation for mapping out complex layers and tensions within food relations in Singapore and beyond. But would like to know the role of wholesale market, know about the role of wholesale markets in Singapore, where small farmers from the region in and around Singapore can distribute produce. It seems that these places will be more or less cut off. What effect will this have on the supermarketization that you had explained?
Okay, I'll start with Lotta's question and then come to Osa's question. Yeah, I feel like Lotta, so yeah, hi Lotta. I think I feel like you already have quite a sense of this as well with cultural practice. But to just give some examples in from the Singapore and Thai context. So food as cultural practice, I would think of there's the eating part of it. But if you look at also say Bakutapan's work, based in Indonesia, they do a lot of work around the practice of eating, of sharing, of celebrating that food, of trying to understand where it comes from. Bakutapan is an art collective as well, I should say that. If you look at what farmers are doing and not just artists, farmers in, let's say the farmers in the coffee, one of the villages I was working in, might, so I'm trying to figure out how to answer the question, how to engage people in relations to food as cultural practice. So for instance, if I come to this village and I'm curious about the way they grow a certain kind of water bamboo, and why are they growing this, and when do they use it? When do they harvest it, and when do they eat it? I might say to them, how do you use it? Can you show it to me? And can we try to eat it? Can we try to cook it differently? So, and the thing is, this is a part of daily life. If anyone is interested in different aspects of how ingredients are produced and made, this is already cultural practice. So there's not any kind of fancy mystique around that. It's just to really engage with it in relations to food. And that's what this distancing that comes with supermarkets, it breaks off this cultural practice. So you don't have the embodied sensory relation to that. Everything just becomes about numbers. And that's what agri-commodity trading does. That's why we end up with this huge fluctuations in where food is coming from. It came from, like there was a big production here in India, but for some reason, because of a desire for one company to shift to something else, suddenly the company switches to something. And then this entire group of people who are producing this, they lose that market. And that comes because of this emotional distancing. So Osa's question. I feel like the wholesale markets would stay as a space. I'm not sure if there have been some changes recently where Pasir Panjang wholesale market has been completely changed. And maybe Osa, you know more about this. I feel like small farmers from the region have not necessarily been distributing directly to it. They may have gone through an aggregator in their country who then sell to Singapore. So in some ways, there has been a bit of aggregation, but the way supermarkets might expand into this and eat up that space is as they try to build their understanding of resilience, that they undercut what these smaller aggregators would be able to do because they have more spending power, they have more capital. So this kind of like quite top level heavy supermarket chains would reduce the number of smaller aggregators, which actually reduces resilience across the system as a whole.
Right. So, I mean, it's pretty interesting. In Singapore, we like to pride ourselves on our food culture, but there's that big distance between food production and the final consumption that we have. So, that's sort of my side. But since we're running short on time, we'll have a last question from Tomomi Shibukawa, who would like Huiying to explain a bit about how urban gardens can facilitate understanding and communication within communities.
Okay, yeah, so Tomomi, I don't know, I think maybe we haven't met before. There's so much that can happen within the urban garden space. If you're really talking about in a city environment, let's say you have a child growing up or a family or older folk, or let's say interracial, multiracial, communities that don't know each other very well, neighbors that, you might just a neighbor who has almost exactly the same upbringing as you, but you've never really spoken to them. So food spaces are one thing. You might have a dining table and you come and eat and share something. But I found across all the gardens I've ever worked in, the moment you start working with plants, most of the time, gardeners want to share something with you, and you start having a conversation about just what you're doing. So it might be, oh, how does this plant grow? When is a good time to eat it? It smells so good. Or like, and then gardeners are very happy to share about what they know because of the love that they have with the plant. So it's not just when we talk about urban gardens, we focus a lot on humans. I'm just saying, like right now, I've been focusing a lot on humans, but the plants play a really big role in the smell and the way that creates communication across the humans and with the earthworms, the other things. So often with friends, we talk about all the other things that happen above the soil and then under the soil. And a lot of understanding and communication that you see across ethnic groups, whatever gardens bring together, it comes through bodily interaction, the senses, smell, touch, play. Gardens are good places to play as well. So it's not just serious, you have time to relax. And that brings really a lot of health benefits, and social communication.
Great. So I guess what I'll do now is if Jeff or Huiying have any sort of final thoughts, perhaps you could leave them here as we wrap up.
Maybe I can just lay like one final set of thoughts.
Please.
Yeah, so just also responding to Christina.
Great.
Yeah, I have really enjoyed hearing from Jeff and also some of the questions people have raised. I know it's been a lot of time spent on looking at my work, which I'm not super used to, but I really hope this opens up questions amongst the audience, and amongst possibly other people who will watch this in future online to see how else we might move forward when it comes to thinking about what I'm really interested in is decolonial understandings and approaches to the way a food ecology is cultivated, and whether we can, as Jeff was talking about, take a kind of a look from outside the system, a look from the commons of what it means to build common spaces for food. Yeah.
Okay. Jeff, anything from you?
Yeah, maybe just to add on to the response to the last question, in terms of how urban garden can function as a place for communication. Yeah, oftentimes people associate community garden as just a place to grow, but there's a lot of other things that happen in the garden, right? So when people engage in collective labor, right, they work together, right? That necessitates kind of communication, talking together, when a stranger walked by the garden and asked a question about a particular plant. And when garden function also as a place of learning about food system, food ecology, you can actually you can hold classes there, and that also facilitates communication. And what is really great about looking at these gardens as common is that they're self-organized. So they are places where people can be creative about the things that they eat, how they work together, and that create knowledge and create communication.
Great, thanks so much. So I know there's there are more questions in the chat, but we're running for about an hour, and I would like to thank all of you for being here. We can't get to all of them, but I am absolutely sure that the questions which we'll and comments which we collected and will be sharing with Huiying will be really helpful for her work. So really thank you all for spending your Friday evening with us. I hope that you've been enriched by this discussion. I certainly have. And I hope to see a lot of you for our next Academia SG Junior Scholar Seminar. Have a great evening and a wonderful weekend. Thanks a lot. See you all soon. Bye-bye.